The letter arrived in Millhaven, Texas on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and it was 4 pages long, written in a hand so careful and deliberate that the station master, old Hector Prout, held it up to the light before tucking it into the leather mail satchel, wondering what kind of man wrote like that, like every word had cost him something. Theodora Ellsworth had come to Millhaven 3 months before that letter was written, arriving on the westbound stage from San Antonio with a single trunk, a hat box, and a photograph of a man she had never met. She was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and brown eyes that held the particular steadiness of a woman who had already survived several things the world had thrown at her. She had answered an advertisement placed in the San Antonio Courier by a cattle rancher named Gerald Ashworth, who was looking for a wife to help manage his household, and as the advertisement put it with admirable plainness, to provide companionship for a man who worked hard and meant to build something lasting in the hill country of West Texas. Gerald Ashworth had been dead for 6 weeks by the time Theodora stepped off that stage. She learned this from the station master himself, who broke the news with his hat in his hands and genuine sorrow in his voice, explaining that Mr. Ashworth had suffered a fall from his horse while checking the north fence line in February, and that the ranch Ashworth's modest but productive 40 acres had passed by the terms of his will to his younger brother in Georgia, a man named Philip who had no interest in ranching and had already sent word that he intended to sell. Theodora stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the stage depot and breathed in the dry, cedar-scented air of Millhaven, and did not allow herself to cry, which was a discipline she had developed over the years. She had grown up in a boarding house in San Antonio run by her mother, a woman of fierce practicality who had raised 3 daughters largely alone after Theodora's father disappeared into the chaos of the cattle drives when Theodora was 9 years old. Crying was something you did after the problem was solved, her mother had always said. Before it was solved, you simply thought harder. So Theodora thought harder. She had exactly $4.30 in her purse. She had a trunk full of practical clothes, a small collection of books she would have starved before selling, and skills that included keeping accounts, making bread, stitching wounds, and managing a household with minimal resources. She asked the station master if there was a respectable boarding house in town, and when he directed her to Mrs. Clarence Foley's establishment on the main road, she walked there with her chin up and her trunk dragging behind her on the wooden boards, and she negotiated a temporary arrangement with Mrs. Foley that involved helping with laundry and cooking in exchange for room and board while she sorted out her circumstances. Millhaven was not a large town. It had a general store run by the Guthrie family, a barber shop, a small church of the Baptist persuasion, a saloon that the Baptist minister regarded with profound disapproval, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a small school that held classes 3 days a week, and a land office. There was also a telegraph office that doubled as the post office, where old Hector Prout presided over the communication needs of the surrounding community with the gravity of a man entrusted with something sacred. Within a week of arriving, Theodora had found a position at the general store, helping Margaret Guthrie manage the accounts and correspondence for their supply orders. Margaret Guthrie was a brisk, sensible woman in her 40s who had been running the store's books herself for 15 years, and who immediately recognized in Theodora a clear mind and an honest character. The pay was modest but sufficient, and Theodora began building a small reserve of savings with the determination of someone planning a longer stay than she had originally intended. Because Millhaven, despite the wreckage of her original plans, had begun to do something unexpected to Theodora Ellsworth. It had begun to feel, in the strange and tentative way of such things, like a place where a life might actually be built. She noticed Cyrus Norris for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in late March, when he came into the general store to buy rope and flour and a new pair of work gloves. He was not the kind of man who was easy to overlook, but he seemed to make considerable effort in that direction. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who do hard physical work, rather than men who are merely large, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were permanently marked with the evidence of outdoor labor. He wore a plain canvas shirt and worn denim trousers, and a hat that had seen better days, and he addressed Margaret Guthrie with a politeness that was clearly genuine rather than performed, asking after her husband's health and listening to the answer with actual attention. Theodora was behind the counter tallying a column of figures when he came in, and she did not look up immediately, finishing her count first because she had learned long ago that interrupted arithmetic was the beginning of all accounting errors. When she did look up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not the appraising look that some men gave women they considered decorative, and it was not the politely blank look of a man pretending a woman was furniture. It was simply a look of direct, uncomplicated interest, as if she had presented a question he was genuinely considering. "Miss Ellsworth," Margaret said, performing the introduction with the ease of a woman who had been engineering social connections in a small town for decades. "This is Cyrus Norris. He runs the Norris spread about 6 miles east of town. Cyrus, this is Theodora Ellsworth, who has been helping me with the accounts these past few weeks." Cyrus Norris removed his hat, which revealed that his hair was even less organized than it had appeared beneath it, and said, "Miss Ellsworth," with a nod that managed to convey both respect and a complete absence of empty ceremony. "Mr. Norris," Theodora said. That was the whole of their first conversation, and yet she thought about it on the walk back to Mrs. Foley's boarding house that evening, with a frequency that she found both illogical and difficult to dismiss. She learned about him gradually, in the way one learns about anyone in a small town, through accumulation rather than revelation. He was 28 years old. He had come to West Texas 5 years before from Missouri, where his family had a small farm, and he had worked as a ranch hand for 2 years before saving enough to claim a piece of land under the Homestead Act and begin building his own spread. He ran cattle, about 40 head, and he was slowly expanding. He had no family in the area. He was not known to frequent the saloon with any regularity. He was regarded by the men of Millhaven as a reliable and fair man who paid his debts, and by the women of Millhaven as something of a mystery, since he showed no apparent interest in finding a wife despite being at an age when most men had long since done so. What she did not learn, because no one in Millhaven knew it, was the reason for that particular reluctance. The thing Cyrus carried with him from Missouri that had made him careful with his heart, the way other men were careful with their last dollar. He had been engaged to be married at 22 to a girl named Rose Calloway whom he had known since childhood. They had planned a wedding for the spring of 1877. In January of that year, Rose Calloway had married a merchant from St. Louis who could offer her a house on a proper street and a life that did not involve the grinding uncertainty of frontier agriculture. She had written him a letter explaining this, and the letter had been kind, which had somehow made it worse. Cyrus had read that letter 3 times and then put it in the stove, and he had spent the next several years building himself a life that was structured around work and solitude and the satisfying certainty of things that did not involve other people's hearts. He had not been unhappy exactly. He had been contained. It was a different thing. He saw Theodora Ellsworth 5 more times in April, twice at the general store, once at the church on a Sunday when he attended services with a sense of social obligation that he managed about twice a month, once at the edge of the road when her boot had apparently caught a loose board on the sidewalk, and she had grabbed the post of the telegraph office to steady herself, and looked up to find him 3 feet away, having witnessed this undignified moment. And once at the spring social held in the field behind the church, where the whole of Millhaven turned out with food and music provided by 2 fiddles and a man with a harmonica. At the spring social, he almost talked to her. He stood approximately 10 feet away for nearly 20 minutes while she spoke with Margaret Guthrie and a young woman named Clara Betts who taught school 3 days a week, and he argued with himself about the fundamental purposelessness of walking over there. He had nothing particular to say. He was not a man who was good at the light, dancing kind of conversation that social occasions seemed to require. He worked with his hands and his mind ran along practical lines, and he was fairly certain he would say something dull or abrupt, and that would be the end of it. He was saved from his own paralysis by the arrival of Del Patterson, who ran the livery stable and who had known Cyrus since his first year in Millhaven, and who pulled him into a conversation about the state of the road to Laredo that lasted until the social was winding down, by which point Theodora Ellsworth had walked back toward town with Mrs. Foley, and the moment, such as it had been, was gone. He rode back to his ranch in the long blue Texas dusk and thought about her brown eyes and the way she had laughed at something Margaret Guthrie said, her whole face shifting with it, and the thought settled in him with the quiet persistence of something that intended to stay. In May, 2 things happened that changed the particular geometry of their situation. The first was that Philip Ashworth arrived in Millhaven from Georgia to finalize the sale of his brother's ranch, a process that involved considerable time in the land office and several conversations with local buyers. One of the potential buyers, as it happened, was Cyrus Norris, who had been quietly saving for 2 years with the intention of expanding his land holdings if an opportunity presented itself. The Ashworth land abutted his own eastern fence line, and adding it to his spread would double his capacity and give him access to a better water source. The second thing that happened was that Theodora Ellsworth, in the course of managing the Guthrie store's correspondence, made an error that she discovered at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, while reviewing her work by lamplight in her room at Mrs. Foley's establishment. An error that meant an order for 100 pounds of cornmeal had been incorrectly routed and was currently sitting in a depot in Waco instead of making its way to Millhaven. She corrected the error the next morning by writing a series of very precise and firm letters, and the cornmeal arrived only 4 days late, which was a minor miracle of determination. But the process of resolving it required her to spend significant time in the telegraph office working with Hector Prout on the messages. And it was there, on a Saturday afternoon, that Cyrus Norris found her, because he had come to send a telegraph message to a cattle broker in San Antonio about pricing. She was leaning over Hector Prout's counter with a pencil in her hand and a look of focused intensity that Cyrus had not seen on any person's face in recent memory, and Hector Prout was explaining the intricacies of telegraph transmission with the enthusiasm of a man who loved his work and rarely found an audience willing to engage with the technical aspects. Cyrus stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "Am I interrupting?" Which was perhaps not the most inspired opening line but had the virtue of being honest. Theodora looked up. "Not at all," she said. "Mr. Prout and I are nearly finished. Come in." He came in. He waited while she finished her business, which took another 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes he sat on the bench along the wall and listened to her work through the problem with Hector Prout. And what he noticed was that she knew exactly what she needed and asked for it clearly, and thanked the man with genuine warmth rather than performative courtesy. And that when Hector Prout made a small joke about the relative intelligence of Waco depot managers, she laughed and then said something kind about the general difficulty of logistics. Because she was clearly a person who did not enjoy being unkind, even when unkindness would have been justified. When she turned from the counter, she found him looking at her again with that same unclassifiable expression, and something in her decided, in the direct way that she made most of her decisions, that she was tired of not knowing what the expression meant. "Do you need something from me, Mr. Norris?" she asked. "You've been looking at me as though you're trying to work something out." He blinked. A man less fundamentally honest might have made something up. Cyrus Norris said, "I suppose I have been. I apologize." "I'm not offended," she said. "I'm curious." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Outside, a horse moved past the window and a child shouted something about a dog. "I've been meaning to say something to you for a while," he said finally. "I'm not good at I don't manage the saying very well." "Say it plainly," she said. "I prefer plain things." He looked at her. "I'd like to know you better, Miss Ellsworth, if that would be agreeable to you." It was so simple and direct, and entirely without the coy performance that such statements usually involve, that she felt something shift in her chest, a warm, tentative thing, like a door opening onto an unfamiliar room. "I think that would be agreeable," she said. "I walk to the river on Sunday afternoons when the weather allows." The path behind the church. He nodded once, with the gravity of a man accepting a contract. "Then I'll see you Sunday," he said. He sent his telegraph message to the broker in San Antonio, and when he rode back to his ranch, he felt something that he had not felt in a long time, a specific kind of anticipation that had nothing to do with cattle prices or fence lines, or whether the rains would come in June. The Sunday walk by the river was the first of several. The path behind the church wound down through cedar and live oak to a creek that ran clear over flat limestone. And it was one of those Texas afternoons in May when the light falls at an angle that makes everything look as though it is happening slightly more beautifully than it would otherwise. They walked side by side with careful, proper distance between them, and they talked. She told him about San Antonio, about her mother's boarding house, about her two younger sisters, one of whom had married a schoolteacher and was living in Austin, the other of whom was still at home helping their mother. She told him about the Ashworth advertisement, honestly and without excessive embarrassment, because it had been a practical decision made in good faith, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told him that she had been surprised to find herself staying in Millhaven, that she had expected to feel stranded and had instead found herself feeling, tentatively, rooted. He told her about Missouri. He told her about the farm and his father, who had been a taciturn, hard-working man with a gift for coaxing crops from difficult soil, and his mother, who had died of fever when Cyrus was 14, which had marked him in ways he was only beginning to understand at 28. He told her about coming west, about the 2 years of ranch work, about the claim and the slow building of his spread. He did not tell her about Rose Calloway, not that first Sunday, but he was aware of her absence in the conversation the way you are aware of a word you have deliberately left out of a sentence. What he discovered in the course of these conversations was something that surprised him with its simplicity. She was easy to be with. Not easy in the sense of requiring nothing. She was clearly a woman with a sharp mind and genuine opinions, and the habit of saying what she thought, but easy in the sense that he did not have to perform anything around her. He could be the slightly quiet, occasionally abrupt, fundamentally earnest man he actually was, and she seemed to find this acceptable. More than acceptable, he began to think. She seemed to genuinely like him, the actual him rather than some more polished version. This was not something he had expected. They walked by the creek for 5 Sundays in a row. On the 3rd Sunday he told her about Rose Calloway, because it seemed dishonest not to, and because he had discovered that dishonesty of omission sat uneasily with him when it came to Theodora. He told her simply, without excessive drama, what had happened and how it had affected his subsequent years. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting, which he appreciated. Then she was quiet for a moment, watching the water move over the limestone. "That explains the looking," she said. "Does it? You were trying to decide whether you could trust what you were feeling," she said, "whether it was worth the risk." He looked at her. "You saw all that from a look." "I'm good with accounts," she said. "I notice when things add up and when they don't. You add up, Cyrus." It was the first time she had used his given name. It landed between them with a warmth that neither of them entirely knew what to do with. "Theodora," he said, trying it out, and she turned to look at him with a small, careful smile that he thought about for the next 3 days. June arrived, and with it, two developments that complicated everything beautifully. The first was that Cyrus successfully negotiated the purchase of the Ashworth land, a transaction that was completed on a Thursday in the land office with Philip Ashworth, who turned out to be a perfectly pleasant man from Savannah, who knew nothing about ranching and frankly seemed relieved to be done with the whole affair. The purchase significantly extended Cyrus's debt to the Territorial Bank, but also significantly expanded his capacity, and he spent the rest of the month consumed in the physical work of integrating the new land into his operation, repairing the Ashworth fences, moving cattle, assessing the water situation, and beginning to plan the additional infrastructure that would be needed. The second development was that Theodora was offered a different position. A man named Weston Hale, who ran the largest ranch in the county, some 20 miles north of Millhaven, sent his foreman into town with a letter for Theodora Ellsworth, who had come to his attention through Margaret Guthrie's enthusiastic praise of her abilities. The letter offered Theodora a position as housekeeper and household manager for the Hale Ranch house, at a salary that was nearly 3 times what she was earning at the general store. It was a genuine opportunity, the kind that did not present itself frequently, and she sat with it in her room at Mrs. Foley's that evening and thought about it with the methodical seriousness she brought to all significant decisions. The problem was Cyrus Norris. She was fully aware that this was a problem she had constructed herself, since they had made each other no promises, spoken no words that constituted anything beyond friendship and the clear mutual suggestion of something more. 5 Sunday walks by a creek did not constitute an obligation on either side. She was not going to make decisions about her professional life based on the existence of a man who had not yet said anything definitive. She decided to decline the offer, and she was honest with herself about why, and she found that being honest with herself about it was both uncomfortable and clarifying in the way that honesty usually was. She wrote back to Weston Hale with a polite refusal and a genuine expression of gratitude for the offer, and she folded the letter and walked it to the telegraph office to be sent the next morning. And she felt, putting it in Hector Pruitt's hand, the specific vertigo of a decision that cannot be unmade. 3 days later, Cyrus Norris came into the general store with a different energy about him, a focused, slightly braced quality that Theodora recognized as the manner of a man who has decided to do something and is making sure he does it before he can talk himself out of it. He bought what he needed. This time it was nails and a length of chain for a gate mechanism he was installing, and when he was done he stood at the counter with his hat in his hand and said, "I heard you turned down the Hale position." She looked at him steadily. "News travels quickly." "It's a small town," he said. "May I ask why?" "You may," she said. "I didn't want to be 20 miles away." The words sat between them like the 4 pages of a letter that had not yet been written. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something, the way he always did, carefully, without rushing, making sure he had it right before he said it. "I have not been very good at this," he said finally, "at saying things. I want you to know that what I feel when I'm with you is—" He stopped. He started again. "I have not felt this way about anyone since I was 22 years old, and I am aware that I have not said that adequately." "You've said it honestly," she said. "That's better than adequately." "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it." "Cyrus," she said, "I think we've been courting for 2 months." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, really smiled, and it changed his whole face in a way that she had not fully seen before, and she thought that if she had not already decided to stay in Millhaven, that smile would have done it. "Then I suppose I should ask your permission to continue," he said. "Granted," she said. July in West Texas in 1883 was hot with the particular ferocity of a climate that did not negotiate. Cyrus worked from before dawn until after dark, driving fence posts and moving cattle and attending to the 100 tasks that the new land had generated, and he came to town on Saturdays when he could manage it. Their Sunday walks by the creek continued, but they were shorter now, because the heat by midday was serious, and they began starting earlier and walking in the morning when the air still held some memory of the previous night's coolness. What began to develop between them was something that Theodora, who was a precise thinker, found almost impossible to be precise about. It was not the dramatic, lightning-struck thing that novels described. It was quieter and more pervasive than that, a gradual suffusion, like water finding its level. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. When she was adding a column of figures and reached the wrong total and had to start again, she would think that he would appreciate the frustration of that, being a man who did not like things that were incorrect. When she saw a red-tailed hawk sitting on a fence post at the edge of town, she thought that he would know its name and probably several facts about its habits. When Mrs. Foley made cornbread that was slightly too salty, she wondered what he cooked for himself out there alone on his spread and whether it was any good. She acknowledged to herself in the direct way that was her nature, completely and somewhat alarmingly in love with Cyrus Norris. The realization arrived not as a thunderclap but as a recognition, like looking at a familiar landscape and suddenly understanding what you have been seeing all along. Cyrus, for his part, was experiencing something similar, though his vocabulary for it was less developed. He knew that he was different when he was with her than at any other time, more present, more himself, as though her particular attentiveness to what he actually said, and meant rather than what he was supposed to say, had somehow called a more complete version of him into being. He knew that the week between Saturdays was too long. He knew that the Sunday walks had become the fixed point around which he organized his week. He knew that when she laughed at something he said, genuinely laughed, not the polite acknowledgement of humor, but the real thing it produced in him, a warmth that he suspected would take a very long time to cool. What he did not know was how to say any of this in a way that adequately conveyed its weight. August brought the first crisis. A dry lightning storm in the third week of August sparked a grass fire on the eastern edge of Cyrus's newly acquired land. He caught it early, before dawn, riding his fence line as he had started doing routinely to assess his pastures, and he managed to contain it with a fire break and the help of 3 neighboring ranchers who came when they saw the smoke, including Del Patterson's older brother James, who brought 2 of his ranch hands. By midday the fire was out and the damage was real but not ruinous. Perhaps 10 acres of grazing land burned, which would take a season to recover, and 1 fence line that needed complete replacement. Cyrus rode into Millhaven that afternoon covered in ash and smelling of smoke, with a minor burn on his left forearm where a falling branch had caught him. He went to the blacksmith first, to arrange for the replacement fence wire, and he was on his way to the general store to check on a supply order when Theodora came out of the door and nearly walked directly into him. She stopped. She looked at him, the ash, the smoke smell, the arm he was holding at a slightly careful angle, and her face did something that he would remember for a long time, a rapid sequence of expressions. Alarm, assessment, relief that he was standing upright, and then a focused, practical concern that went immediately to the most important thing. "Your arm," she said. "It's not serious," he said. "I can see that it's not going to kill you," she said. "That doesn't mean it's not serious. Come inside." She had, he discovered, a small kit that Margaret Guthrie kept behind the counter for exactly this kind of situation, a West Texas store being the kind of place where such things were practical rather than precautionary. She cleaned the burn with carbolic and bandaged it with a competence that suggested she had done this kind of thing before, and he sat on a stool behind the counter and let her work and watched her hands move with the quiet efficiency that she brought to everything. "Were you frightened?" she asked, wrapping the bandage. "No," he said. "During it, you don't have time to be frightened. After is when it gets you." She looked up at him, and after, he held her gaze. "I thought about you," he said. "When I was riding back in, I thought about what I had not yet said to you." He paused. "That frightened me a little." She tied off the bandage and did not immediately move her hands, and he was very aware of her fingers resting lightly on his forearm just above the edge of the dressing. "What have you not yet said?" she asked. "Theodora," he said, and then he said the rest of it, simply and without performance, the way he did everything when he finally committed to doing it. "I am in love with you. I don't know that I've managed it very gracefully, and I know that the life I'm building is hard and uncertain and not what any person would choose if they had other options. But I am in love with you, and I wanted you to know that regardless of what you do with it." She was very still for a moment, and then she lifted her eyes to meet his, and in them he saw the same thing he had been carrying around for months, the same warm and careful and certain thing, and he exhaled. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I've known it for weeks. I was waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, startled out of the gravity of the moment, and she laughed with him. And Margaret Guthrie, who had been with absolute deliberateness staying in the back room organizing a shelf of cloth that did not need organizing, allowed herself a private smile that she did not share with anyone until that evening, when she told her husband, who received the news with the mild pleasure of a man who finds other people's happiness agreeable. The question of marriage arose not dramatically but practically, the way most important things did between two practical people. He asked her in September on a Sunday morning, standing in the shallow water of the creek with their boots off because it was still warm enough for that, and the water was clear over the limestone, and a kingfisher sat in the cypress above them regarding them with what appeared to be professional disdain. He said, "I want to marry you, Theodora. I want to build a life with you on my spread. I want you to know before you answer that it's hard work and the house needs things done to it, and I am not always easy to live with, because I'm quiet sometimes and I work too much and I forget to stop until I'm already exhausted. But I will love you honestly, and I will never lie to you, and I will work every day of my life to make sure you don't regret it." She considered him for a moment, standing there in the creek with his boots in one hand and his hat in the other, and the Texas sun making the water glitter around his ankles, and she thought that she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, Cyrus." They were married in the Millhaven Baptist Church on a Saturday in late October of 1883, which was, as several people pointed out, an excellent time for a wedding in Texas, because the heat had broken, and the light in October was extraordinary, that particular golden clarity that the hill country managed for about 6 weeks before winter arrived. Margaret Guthrie made her a dress from a bolt of ivory cotton that had come in on the last supply wagon, and Mrs. Foley contributed a small cake, and Del Patterson played the fiddle because the regular musician had a bad cold, and the whole of Millhaven turned out with the enthusiasm of a community that understands that weddings are a form of collective celebration. Theodora's younger sister, Ellen, had come up from San Antonio for the occasion, traveling on the stage with the stoic endurance of a woman who had made the journey before and knew exactly what to expect, and she sat in the front pew with streaming eyes that she attempted to conceal behind a handkerchief and failed. Their mother had been unable to make the journey due to a bout of arthritis that had laid her low for the past month, which was the only shadow on the day, but Theodora had written her a long letter describing everything in advance so that she could be present in her imagination. Cyrus stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had borrowed from James Patterson, who was slightly broader in the shoulder than him, so it fit reasonably well. And when Theodora came through the door on the arm of Hector Prout, who had volunteered for this function since there was no male family member available, and he saw her in the ivory dress with her dark auburn hair, arranged under a simple arrangement of dried flowers that Margaret Guthrie had made, he felt the solid certainty of someone who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. The ceremony was brief and sincere, conducted by Reverend Aldous Thorne, who was a Baptist of the straightforward rather than theatrical variety, and who managed the words of the ceremony with simple dignity. When he pronounced them married, Cyrus took Theodora's face in both of his large, work-roughened hands with extraordinary gentleness and kissed her, and she heard Ellen sob openly from the front pew and felt a deep, complete happiness that she thought might actually be the realest thing she had ever felt. They stayed at Mrs. Foley's boarding house that Saturday night, because the drive to the ranch in the dark was impractical, and set off the next morning in the wagon with the clear, still air of an October Sunday around them, and Theodora's trunk and hatbox in the back, along with several boxes of household items that had been given as wedding gifts by the people of Millhaven, who were generous in the particular way of communities that know the practical value of such things. The ranch house was not grand. It was a solid stone structure of 2 rooms, with a separate kitchen that had been built as a lean-to addition against the south wall, and a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning light. Cyrus had spent the previous 2 weeks cleaning and repairing it with the focused energy of a man preparing a space for another person, and he had been ruthlessly honest with himself about its shortcomings, which included a floor in the main room that needed resanding, a window in the second room that did not close all the way, and a kitchen that was functional but bare. Theodora stood on the porch in the October morning and looked at the land spreading east from the house, the pale gold of the dry grass going to the horizon, the cedar breaks darker against it, and the sky above it all a particular shade of deep blue that she had not seen anywhere but Texas, and she felt, with a certainty that settled all the way to her bones, that she was home. "Tell me what you want done to it," he said, standing beside her. "It doesn't need a great deal," she said. "The window in the back room, the floor. I'd like to plant something on the south side, there's good light there." "Roses," he said. "There's a ranch wife out near Fredericksburg who sells starts. I'll get you some in spring." She turned to look at him. "You thought about roses." "I thought about what might make it more like yours," he said simply. She took his hand, which was something she had not done before, and his fingers closed around hers with the same careful, deliberate warmth that he brought to everything, and they stood there on the porch looking at the land that was now theirs and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was hard in the way that Texas winters could be. Not the cold of the northern states, but a grinding, gray cold that came with northern winds and the particular bleakness of a landscape stripped of its summer color. Cyrus worked every day regardless of weather, and Theodora worked alongside him more often than he had expected, because she was a woman who did not distinguish between indoor and outdoor labor as sharply as convention suggested she ought to. She learned to manage the chickens he had acquired, added a kitchen garden to her plans for spring, kept meticulous accounts of the ranch's finances, and wrote letters every week to her mother and her sisters, long detailed letters that were the lifeline of a woman who loved her family and lived 6 days' journey from them by stage. In February, there was a week when a blue norther pinned them both in the house for 4 days. The temperature dropped sharply, the cedar outside creaked in the wind, and the horses in the small barn needed extra feed and attention. Cyrus came in from the barn on the second day covered in hay and carrying a sheen of ice on his hat from the sleet, and Theodora handed him a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table with her book while he thawed, and he looked at her reading in the lamplight and thought that there was no version of this moment that was not exactly right. "Read to me," he said. She looked up. "What?" "Read aloud. Whatever you're reading." She was reading Washington Irving, which she told him, and he said he didn't know the man, and she said she thought he would like him, and she read to him for 2 hours that afternoon while the sleet ticked against the windows and the coffee went slowly cold, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that she had noticed in him from the beginning, the full, unperformed kind. It became a habit after that. She read to him in the evenings, and he listened, and sometimes he asked questions that surprised her with their precision, and she discovered that beneath the practical exterior of a man who thought primarily in terms of fence lines and cattle weights was a mind that was genuinely curious about everything, that could take the fanciful world of a literary story and hold it alongside the real world and find the places where they intersected. "You should read more yourself," she told him one evening in March. "I never had much time for it," he said, "and I'm a slow reader. I didn't have much schooling past 12. "Slow readers often understand what they read better than quick ones," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My handwriting is not good," he said. "My letters don't look the way they're supposed to. I got embarrassed about it young and I stopped writing much." She looked at him. "Show me." "Theodora, show me," she said. "Get a piece of paper and write something." He did it with the slight stiffness of a man doing something that makes him feel exposed, and what he produced was not the neat copperplate of a formal education, but it was entirely legible, large and deliberate and clear, each letter formed with care. She looked at it for a moment. "You write fine," she said. "The letters are too big and they don't slope right." "They're your letters," she said. "They look like you." She paused, honest and careful and clear, exactly right. Something shifted in his face when she said that, a small, private change that she noticed and stored carefully. He had been embarrassed about this for a long time, she understood. Someone, probably at an early age, had made him feel that the way he did this particular thing was wrong, and it had closed something in him. "You should write to your father," she said. "In Missouri, do you?" "Not often," he said. "Not since I left." "Write to him," she said. "Tell him about the ranch. Tell him you're married." She paused. "Cyrus, the man, doesn't know he has a daughter-in-law." He looked at her with something between sheepishness and genuine shame. "I've been meaning to." "Then do it," she said. "Tonight, I'll give you paper." He wrote the letter that night, slowly and carefully at the kitchen table while she sat nearby sewing, and what he produced was 3 pages to his father about the ranch and the new land and his marriage to Theodora, and it was honest and direct and written in his large, deliberate hand. And when he finished it, he read it back to himself and handed it to her. She read it and did not edit a word. She folded it and addressed the envelope and said, "I'll take it to Mr. Prout tomorrow." Then she paused and looked at him with something warm in her expression. "Was that the first letter you've written?" he considered. "To someone who mattered," he said slowly. "Yes, I suppose it was." "You should do it more," she said. "You're good at it." He wrote back to his father when his father replied, and the correspondence that reopened between them in the spring of 1884 was halting at first, and then gradually more fluent. Two men who had never been particularly verbal with each other discovering that there was something about the written word that allowed them to say what the spoken word could not quite reach. His father wrote about Missouri, about the farm, about a series of difficulties with the younger brother's management of their shared land, and Cyrus wrote back with genuine attention and occasional practical advice. And it was something, he found, that was better than nothing after years of silence. But the letter, the true letter, the one that came to define something between him and Theodora, that came later, in April of 1884, and it came about because of what happened with the Harker situation. Thomas Harker was a rancher from 2 counties over who had been engaged in a long-running dispute with several smaller landholders in the region over water rights along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Cyrus's land. Harker ran a much larger operation than most of his neighbors, and had a lawyer in Austin, and the kind of casual arrogance that comes with having had more money than sense for a generation. The dispute had been simmering for years before Cyrus acquired the Ashworth land, and with the acquisition, Cyrus became one of the parties whose water access was affected. Harker sent a man to the Norris ranch in early April to inform Cyrus that Harker intended to divert the creek at the upper fence line to feed a new stock tank, which would reduce the flow through Cyrus's pasture significantly. Cyrus heard the man out, thanked him with careful courtesy, and immediately rode to town to see the county land commissioner, a man named Otis Briggs, about the legal dimensions of the water rights question. What Briggs told him was that the situation was genuinely complicated, that the water rights in the region had not been fully formalized, and that Harker likely had enough legal resources to make a challenge very expensive and very slow. He advised Cyrus that the best approach was to document everything carefully, organize his fellow affected landholders, and make a formal complaint to the county before Harker could begin construction, because once the diversion was built, it would be vastly more difficult to reverse. Cyrus came home that evening with the specific grim focus of a man who has been handed a problem that requires sustained effort rather than immediate action. Theodora was in the kitchen when he came in, and she heard the quality of his boots on the floor harder, more deliberate, and looked at him when he came through the door. "Tell me," she said, because she had learned this about him, that he needed to be invited to unload rather than simply presumed willing. He told her. She listened to the whole thing, and then she said, "How many of the other ranchers are affected?" "5 that I know of: James Patterson, the Gonzalez family south of the creek, Old Whitmore on the north side, the Kellerman brothers, and myself." "Then you need to meet," she said, "together as a group before Harker can pick you apart individually." "Have you corresponded with any of them?" "I've spoken to James." "Write to the others tonight," she said. "Invite them to a meeting. I'll draft the language if you'd like something that's clear about the purpose without being inflammatory. The goal is to build a unified position before Harker's lawyer starts dividing you." He looked at her with the expression he sometimes got when she did something that reminded him how fortunate he had been in his choice of wife. It was not a patronizing look. It was the look of a man who genuinely admires competence in another person. "You'd be good at this," he said. "I'm good at organizing things," she said. "And I was raised by a woman who fought every landlord and supplier and creditor she ever had, which amounts to a practical education in the management of disputes." They spent the evening at the kitchen table together, writing 4 letters to the 4 affected ranchers, Theodora drafting the language and Cyrus writing it out in his large, careful hand, because it was his ranch and his name on the letter, and she understood instinctively that it mattered for the thing to come from him. The letters were clear and specific and reasonable, and managed to convey both the seriousness of the situation and the opportunity for collective response, and they went out in the mail the next day. 3 of the 4 ranchers responded affirmatively. The 4th, Old Whitmore, who was a man of approximately 80 years and the disposition of a particularly suspicious badger, sent back a note saying he didn't trust meetings, but that he agreed with the general principle, and would do what the group decided, which Theodora said counted as a yes and Cyrus said probably counted as more than that, coming from Whitmore. The meeting was held at the Norris Ranch on a Saturday in the 2nd week of April. Cyrus had spent the previous week riding to each of the affected properties to speak with each man personally as well, because he understood that the letter had opened the door, but the trust that would make collective action possible had to be built face to face. Theodora made coffee and a quantity of cornbread, and handled the logistical side of the meeting with the same efficiency she brought to everything. And she sat at the table and took notes on the discussion while the men talked, not because she had been asked to, but because she could see that no one else was doing it and someone should. It was during this meeting that Eduardo Gonzalez, who ran a modest cattle and farming operation with his 2 adult sons on land his family had held since before Texas was a state, said something that lodged in Cyrus's mind. He said, quietly, near the end of the discussion when they were working through what documentation Otis Briggs had said they needed, "My family has been on this land since 1841. We have the papers. But I have been told many times that the papers do not always mean what they are supposed to mean. I am glad to be in this with men who will stand as witnesses." There was a gravity in the way he said it that Cyrus thought about long after the meeting was over. The recognition that for Eduardo Gonzalez and his family, the question of water rights was inseparable from a longer history of having their legal standing questioned and dismissed, and that what they needed from their neighbors was not just practical alliance, but something closer to testimony. He filed this away, and it shaped the way he conducted himself in the subsequent dealings with Harker's attorney, making sure that Eduardo Gonzalez's documentation and the history of his family's land use were given equal weight to everything else in the record that Otis Briggs assembled. The Harker dispute was resolved, ultimately in June, when the county commissioner ruled formally that the planned diversion was inconsistent with the established water rights of the downstream properties, and that any modification of the creek flow required the consent of all affected parties. Thomas Harker, facing the united front of 6 landholders and a county commissioner who had decided the matter definitively, did not press further, which was the outcome Cyrus had been working toward, not a victory over Harker so much as a sufficiently clear statement of the situation that it was not worth Harker's while to fight. Eduardo Gonzalez came to the Norris ranch the week after the decision to thank Cyrus, and the 2 men stood on the porch with coffee and talked for an hour about ranching and land, and the particular challenges of building something lasting in a place where the legal landscape was still being settled. Theodora joined them for part of this conversation, and when Eduardo left he shook her hand as well as Cyrus's and said, in a slightly formal and entirely sincere way, that Cyrus was a lucky man, and Cyrus said he knew it. But it was earlier in April, before all of this, in the gap between the initial crisis and the collective response, in a particular week when Cyrus had ridden to San Antonio for 3 days to consult with a lawyer there about the water rights situation, leaving Theodora alone at the ranch for the first time, that the letter was written. He had not intended to write to her. He had expected to be back within 3 days, which was just about manageable as an absence, and he had left with the ranch in good order and Del Patterson's oldest boy, 16-year-old Tom, checking in daily to make sure the horses were watered and the chickens were fed. He had kissed Theodora goodbye on a Tuesday morning and ridden out while the stars were still up. On Wednesday evening, the business with the lawyer ran longer than expected, complicated by the discovery that there were additional historical documents that needed to be reviewed, and it became apparent that he would not be back until Saturday at the earliest. He sent a telegraph message to Hector Prout to be passed to Theodora, which was efficient and practical and completely inadequate to what he actually felt about the situation, which was a longing so specific and physical that it surprised him. He was staying in a boarding house near the main plaza in San Antonio, a decent enough establishment run by a Mexican family who fed their guests well and asked few questions. He ate supper alone that Wednesday evening, watching the oil lamps on the other tables and the other people at them, and he thought about Theodora in the ranch house with the oil lamp burning in the kitchen, probably reading or writing her weekly letter to her mother, and he reached for the pen and paper that the boarding house kept in a small writing desk in the room for exactly this purpose, and he began to write. He had never written a letter to a woman he loved. He had never written a letter to anyone that involved the kind of thing he was trying to say, which was not news or information or practical arrangement, but simply the truth of what he was experiencing, the specific texture of her absence, the way the city around him felt loud and impersonal in a way that made him understand how thoroughly he had come to associate home with her presence. He wrote slowly, in his careful, deliberate hand, forming the letters the way he always did, larger than convention dictated, each one individually made rather than joined in the smooth cursive of formal schooling. He wrote the way he spoke to her when they were alone together, honestly and without performance, and he found that once he had started the words came with less difficulty than he had expected, because he was talking to her, not to the idea of her, and he always knew what to say to her. He filled the first page with an account of the journey and the lawyer's consultation, and the things he had seen in San Antonio, the large and somewhat chaotic city that seemed like a different world from Millhaven. And then somewhere in the middle of the first page, he stopped writing about events and started writing about how he felt. And he did not stop until he reached the end of the 4th page. He wrote about missing her in language that he would have been incapable of speaking aloud, not because he was ashamed of it, but because the spoken version would never have been sufficient, because speech moved too quickly and evaporated too immediately, and what he felt was something that deserved to be written down so it could be held. He wrote about the ranch and their life together and the specific happiness of the past 6 months, and he wrote about the morning she had told him his handwriting looked like him, honest and careful and clear, and how that had changed something in him, how she had a gift for seeing the real version of things and making the real version feel worth having. He wrote about the future, about what he wanted for them, and he did so in the concrete terms of a practical man whose imagination ran to specifics rather than abstractions. He wanted to build a proper second room onto the house before winter. He wanted to put in the roses she had asked for along the south wall. He wanted to expand the herd to 60 head by next year and start saving against the eventual possibility of a very good breeding bull. And alongside these practical things, he wrote the other things, that he wanted to grow old with her on that land, that he could not imagine any version of a good life that did not have her in the center of it, that she had been worth every year of the waiting even though he had not known what he was waiting for. 4 pages. His large, careful hand, each letter formed with deliberate attention, slightly larger than it was supposed to be, entirely clear. He folded it, addressed the envelope, and mailed it from the San Antonio post office on Thursday morning, calculating that it would reach Millhaven and be delivered to Hector Prout while he was still on the road home. He arrived back at the ranch on Saturday afternoon, dusty from the road and tired in the way of 3 days of legal discussions, which were more exhausting than physical labor in his experience. And Theodora was on the porch when he rode up, sitting with the letter in her lap open, having clearly read it more than once. She stood when she saw him, and he dismounted and led the horse to the fence and looped the reins over the post, and she came down from the porch steps and met him in the yard, and she was holding the letter in both hands. "You wrote me 4 pages, she said. "I had things to say," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with the particular brightness that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them. "You said you had never written a letter to anyone who mattered," she said. "That was before you," he said. She put her hands, the one still holding the letter, flat against his chest, and he covered them with his own, and she leaned her forehead against him and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "It was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "It was just a letter," he said. "It was you," she said. "That's the same thing." He put his arms around her, dusty coat and all, and held her in the yard in the afternoon light with the cedars moving in the hot summer wind, and he felt the particular wholeness of a man who has come home to the right place with the right person, and thought that this was what he had been building toward without knowing it, not the ranch or the land or the expanded herd, but this, exactly this. She framed the letter, which he found both moving and slightly embarrassing, not the whole of it but a single paragraph from the middle of the 2nd page, the one where he had written about the specific color of the light on October mornings when it came through the east window of the kitchen, and she was reading at the table, and how it was a sight he intended to spend the rest of his life not taking for granted. She framed it in a simple wooden frame that she bought from the Guthrie General Store and hung it on the wall of the main room, and he passed it every day for years and was never entirely sure whether to feel proud or bare, but he supposed that was the nature of having been truly seen by another person. The rest of 1884 and all of 1885 were years of building, in the most direct and physical sense. They added the 2nd room to the house in October of 1884. Cyrus and James Patterson and Eduardo Gonzalez's eldest son Miguel working on it over 2 weekends with stone from the same quarry as the original walls. Theodora ran the household accounts with a precision that meant the ranch ended the year with more resources than it had begun with, which was not always a given in the cattle business of West Texas, where weather and price fluctuations and the unpredictability of the land could undo a year's work quickly. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring of 1884 that was modest in scope but generous in production. And the roses came in the spring of 1885, ordered through a woman in Fredericksburg, as Cyrus had promised, planted along the south wall in the good light, and they bloomed that first June with the determination of something that intended to last. Their first child was born in the spring of 1886, a son they named James William Norris James for James Patterson, who had become something like family in the years since their arrival in Millhaven, and William for Cyrus's father, who was still living in Missouri and who had written, when Cyrus had sent him the news of the pregnancy, the longest and most emotional letter of their correspondence. Full of things William Norris had apparently been storing up for years and had finally found the occasion to say. The birth was attended by Mrs. Foley, who had done this work before, and by a doctor who had arrived in Millhaven in late 1885, a young man from Baltimore named Dr. Everett Marsh, who had come west for reasons he was vague about, but who was competent and thorough, and had the gift of explaining what he was doing in ways that reduced the fear of the people he was working with rather than increasing it. The birth was difficult enough to remind everyone in the room that this was serious work and not something to be taken lightly, and Cyrus spent the hours of it outside the bedroom in a state of barely suppressed terror that he recognized as the exact inverse of his ordinary self-possession, unable to do anything useful and finding that almost insupportable. When James William Norris arrived in the world at 4 in the morning of a cold March night, announcing himself immediately and loudly, Dr. Marsh opened the bedroom door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Norris, and your wife is well." And Cyrus sat down hard on the bench outside the door because his legs had decided they were done for the moment. He went in and sat beside Theodora on the bed and looked at the small, furious, impossibly new person that she was holding with practiced calm despite having been awake for 20 hours, and he took her free hand in both of his and held it and did not say anything because there was nothing that reached. "He looks like you," she said. "Those are your eyebrows." "Poor boy," he said, which made her laugh quietly, tiredly, happily. He wrote to his father that day, before he slept, a letter of 3 pages about the birth and the child and Theodora, and for the second time in his life the words came with the particular ease of things that have been felt completely, and then allowed to become language. He was not the same man who had struggled over correspondence with a sense of exposure and inadequacy. He was, in the specific way of a person shaped by love and time, and the willingness of another person to receive them as they actually were, a man who had found his voice. William Norris, S.R., made the journey from Missouri to Texas in the summer of 1886 to meet his grandson, a journey that required significant determination from a man of 63 with arthritis in his knees, but that he made anyway, arriving on the stage from San Antonio with a face weathered to the color of old oak and eyes that were exactly Cyrus's eyes, deep-set and steady, taking everything in. He stayed for 2 weeks and spent most of his time on the porch watching the land and holding the baby when Theodora allowed it, which was often, and he and Cyrus talked more in those 2 weeks than they had in the entire previous 10 years. The particular catch-up conversation of men who had not found their way to each other until it was almost late. On the last evening, sitting on the porch in the warm August dark, William said, "I was wrong about the West. I thought you were running away from something. But you were building something." "Both, maybe," Cyrus said. "Your mother would have liked this place," William said. "She would have liked your wife especially." Cyrus looked out at the land, at the stars coming up above the eastern line. "I know," he said. "I think she would have." William Norris, S.R., went back to Missouri the next morning and died there quietly in his sleep 2 winters later, in January of 1889, leaving his share of the Missouri farm to Cyrus, who sold it and put the money into a fund for James's education, because education was the one thing Theodora felt most strongly about providing for their children, and Cyrus had learned to take her strong feelings seriously. because by January of 1889 there were 2 children. Their daughter, Clara Rose Norris, had been born in August of 1888, 20 months after James, arriving with considerably less drama than her brother and a calm self-possession that she seemed to have been born with, regarding the world from the first days of her life with dark eyes that were entirely her mother's and the same quality of careful assessment. Theodora held her and said, "Well, hello there," with the warmth of someone meeting a person they already know they are going to love, and Clara fixed her mother with that steady, considering look, and Theodora laughed and said, "Yes, that's right, exactly like that." Clara Rose Norris was named Rose for the roses along the south wall, because Theodora wanted her to know from her name that there were things in her life that had been planted on purpose and had bloomed on their own terms and were worth being named for. The letter had not diminished with the years. Theodora still had it, the full 4 pages folded into an envelope that she kept in the small cedar box on the shelf in the bedroom, where she also kept her mother's hair comb, and her sister Ellen's last letter, and a seed packet from the first year of her kitchen garden. She read it occasionally, not from nostalgia, but from the same reason people return to any text that has meant something to them, the recognition that it continues to mean something, that the thing it says is not less true for having been said before. Cyrus continued to write. He wrote to his father until his father died. He wrote to Eduardo Gonzalez when Eduardo's eldest son Miguel moved to Laredo, and he knew Eduardo was lonely for conversation beyond his immediate family. He wrote to Theodora's mother in San Antonio, a correspondence that the old woman treasured and that Theodora found both touching and slightly amusing, because her mother and her husband shared a dry, practical wit that expressed itself better in writing than in person. He wrote to James Patterson when James spent a winter in New Mexico helping his wife's family after a flood, long letters about ranch business and the children and the state of the road to Laredo, which had improved somewhat. He had never been a man who found words easy, and he still wasn't exactly. But he had learned, under the steady influence of a woman who valued honesty above fluency and precision above performance, that the words he had were sufficient, that saying a real thing in plain language was more valuable than saying a beautiful thing in borrowed language, that a letter written in large, careful, slightly unschooled handwriting, formed with deliberate attention by a man who had learned to read later than he should have and had been embarrassed about it for 20 years, could be the most beautiful thing one person had ever given another. He told her that once, in the kitchen on a winter evening in 1890 when the children were asleep and the fire was down to coals, and they were sitting across the table from each other with coffee that had gone cold, the way it always did because they talked too long. "I used to be ashamed of how I write," he said, out of what appeared to be nowhere but was actually the continuation of something he had been thinking about for a while, which was a characteristic of his that she had long since learned to recognize and find endearing. "I know," she said. "It took me a long time to understand that it didn't matter," he said, "that what was in the letter was the thing, not how it looked." She looked at him across the table. "You understood it the first time you wrote me," she said. "That first letter from San Antonio, you figured it out right there." 4 pages, he said. "I didn't know I had 4 pages in me." "You had more than 4 pages," she said. "You always did." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he did, with that same careful warmth he had brought to everything since the first day she had seen him looking at her from across a store counter, with an expression she had needed months to classify. She had classified it eventually, she thought. It was the look of a man who had found something he had not expected to find and was deciding what it meant. She knew what it meant now. She had known for a long time. "Cyrus," she said. "I want to tell you something," she said, and he looked at her with the attentive steadiness that was so completely him she could not imagine any version of her life that did not include it. "Before you came along, I was building a practical life, a sensible arrangement. I had plans that made sense on paper. And then Gerald Ashworth died, and I was stranded in a small town in West Texas with $4.30. I know, he said. What I didn't know, she said, was that being stranded in that exact particular place at that exact particular time was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because of what I found here, because of who, she paused. You. Specifically, unmistakably, irreplaceably you. He held her hand across the cold coffee and the lamplight and said nothing for a long moment, and she could see him feeling the full weight of what she had said, not deflecting it with modesty or rushing past it with practicality, but receiving it the way it was meant completely. I rode back from San Antonio on that Saturday, he said finally, and you were on the porch with the letter, and I thought, whatever else happens, whatever goes wrong with the ranch or the land or the weather or anything else, whatever the next 30 years looks like, she will be there. And that was enough, that was more than enough. She squeezed his hand. Outside, the Texas night was cold and clear and enormous, the way it was in winter, and the stars above the hill country were the same stars that had always been there, unchanged by any of the small human dramas playing out beneath them. And inside the kitchen of the stone ranch house on the Norris, spread 6 miles east of Millhaven, a woman with dark auburn hair just beginning to show silver at the temples, and a man with hands that were permanently marked with the evidence of outdoor labor sat across from each other in the lamplight and held on. The years continued. James Norris grew into a boy with his father's height and his mother's precision, and by the time he was 8, he had read more books than Cyrus had in his entire life, which Cyrus regarded with unambiguous pride. He was a serious child with a gift for mathematics, and a stubbornness that was so entirely his own that neither parent could entirely blame themselves for it, though each privately suspected the other. Clara, 2 years younger, was a different creature entirely. Where James was methodical, she was mercurial. Where he was steady, she was brilliant and variable, filled with enthusiasms that cycled rapidly and intensely and left the household somewhat breathless but rarely bored. Ellen, Theodora's younger sister, came to visit in the summer of 1891 and stayed through September, which was longer than intended and was due entirely to the presence of Tom Patterson Dell's son, now 23, and working his father's livery stable with genuine skill, who had the extremely poor timing to fall thoroughly in love with Ellen Ellsworth on approximately the 3rd day of her visit. This situation resolved itself happily in the following spring when Ellen returned to Millhaven and married Tom Patterson in the same Baptist church where Cyrus and Theodora had married, with Theodora in the front pew, demonstrating that emotional response was not exclusively her sister's territory. Theodora's mother, Frances Ellsworth, came to Millhaven in the fall of 1892, when the arthritis had settled enough to permit the journey, and when she could no longer bear to know her grandchildren only through letters, however detailed. She was a small, upright woman of 60, with white hair and brown eyes that were exactly Theodora's, and she arrived with the brisk assessment of a woman who has been running a boarding house for 30 years and can evaluate a household in under 5 minutes. She evaluated the Norris ranch thoroughly, both the physical structure and the human arrangements, and pronounced herself satisfied with both, which was the highest endorsement anyone who knew Frances Ellsworth had ever heard her deliver. She stayed for 6 weeks and spent most of her time with James and Clara, telling them stories about San Antonio and about Theodora as a child, stories that Theodora found simultaneously embarrassing and precious, because they were the kind of stories that could only come from a parent, the archive of a person's early self, before they became fully formed. James listened with the focused attention of a child building an understanding of his family's history. Clara demanded that every story be acted out dramatically, which Frances managed with surprising willingness for a woman of her age and temperament. On the last evening of Frances's visit, Theodora sat with her on the porch in the September warmth, and Frances said, I was afraid for you when you went to Millhaven, after everything with the Ashworth business. I thought you had made a terrible mistake." "I know," Theodora said. "And then your first letter came," Francis said, "describing the town, and you described it the way you describe places you intend to stay." She paused. "And then you wrote about this man you had met, and you described him like you described the town, like something you intended to stay with." Theodora was quiet for a moment. The cedars moved at the edge of the yard and the first evening stars were appearing above the hill. "I was afraid too," she said, "not of him, of wanting it too much, of needing it to be real and finding out it wasn't." "But it was real," Francis said. "It was very real," Theodora said. "It was more real than anything I had planned." Francis reached over and patted her daughter's hand in the particular way she had done since Theodora was small, the quick firm pat that was her version of everything that other people expressed at greater length. "Good," she said. "Then I was right to let you go." "You couldn't have stopped me," Theodora said. "No," Francis agreed. "I never could stop you once you'd made up your mind." Cyrus came around the corner of the house at that point, coming from the barn with his hat pushed back and his hands cleaned of the day's work, and he saw the two women on the porch and stopped, reading the quality of the moment correctly, and almost turned away. "Don't retreat," Theodora said. "Come sit with us." He came and sat in the third chair, and Francis gave him the assessing look she gave everyone and then said, in the direct way she had that was so much like her daughter, "You have made my daughter happy, Mr. Norris." "She has made it easy," he said. Francis considered this for a moment. "No," she said, "she hasn't. She is an extremely difficult woman to love correctly, but you've managed it." "Mama," Theodora said. "It's a compliment," Francis said, "to both of you." Cyrus smiled, that full smile that still did to Theodora what it had always done, and said, "I take it as one, Mrs. Ellsworth." Frances Ellsworth left for San Antonio the next morning, and when the stage carried her out of sight, Theodora held herself together with the composure that was her nature, and then put her face in Cyrus's shoulder for approximately 30 seconds, which was all she permitted herself, and then straightened up and went to start the morning's work. There was always work. The ranch grew gradually and steadily over the years, the herd expanding, the land productive. The house extended twice more until it was a proper home of 5 rooms with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a kitchen garden that Theodora had expanded to include an orchard of 3 young peach trees along the north side. The town of Millhaven grew too. A new school was built in 1888, a proper brick building with 2 rooms and a full-time teacher, and James Norris was in the first class it enrolled, sitting in the front row with his mother's focus and his father's handwriting, and the particular combination of both that made him entirely himself. Clara followed 2 years later with opinions about everything, including the arrangement of the desks, which she communicated to the teacher on her first day in a manner that was so polite and so implacable that the teacher, a young woman from Houston, spent several years not being entirely sure who was running the class. In 1893, a 3rd child arrived, another son, whom they named Eduardo William Norris, Eduardo for Eduardo Gonzalez, who had by this point become one of Cyrus's closest friends, a man whose steadiness and history and wit Cyrus valued as highly as almost anything outside his own family, and William again for his grandfather, because the name seemed to belong in the family. Eduardo William Norris arrived with the same easy entry as Clara, apparently having inherited his sister's disposition for arriving without excessive drama, and he was a child from the beginning of a remarkable physical energy, who appeared to be in motion even when asleep, and who had his father's outdoor orientation and his mother's absolute fearlessness in pursuing what he wanted. The year Eduardo was born was also the year that Cyrus began teaching himself to read more fluently, systematically, working through Theodora's small library with the same deliberate patience he brought to building fence lines or expanding the herd. He had always been a slow reader, and he had carried the shame of it for years. But Theodora had worn away at that shame gradually and consistently, not by telling him it didn't matter, which was untrue. It had mattered to him, but by making the actual practice of reading something they did together rather than something he did alone and found inadequate. He read to the children the way she had read to him, slowly and with attention, and James sometimes corrected his pronunciation with the complete lack of tact that 9-year-olds deployed without malice, and Cyrus took the corrections without embarrassment, which was something he could not have done 10 years before. The reading opened things for him that he had not expected. He found in his late 30s that his mind had an appetite he had not previously fed, and he read his way through Theodora's library, and then through books borrowed from the new school, and then through everything Hector Prout could order for him through the mail, which Hector did with the enthusiasm of a man who considered the distribution of reading material to be among his highest callings. He wrote more too. His correspondence had expanded to include the county commissioner, who had found Cyrus to be a reliable and thoughtful voice on local land management questions, and occasionally to the state land office in Austin on matters that affected the small ranchers of the region. His handwriting remained large and deliberate and slightly unschooled, and he no longer cared, which was the final resolution of something that had been unfinished in him since he was 12 years old, sitting in a Missouri classroom being told that his letters didn't slope correctly. On the occasion of their 10th anniversary, in late October of 1893, he wrote Theodora a letter. Not because he was away, he was not. He was right there, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while the children were settled and the house had gone quiet. He wrote her a letter because there were 10 years' worth of things to say, and because the letter had always been the best way he had of saying them, and because she had kept the first one in a cedar box for a decade, and he thought she might keep this one too. He wrote her 6 pages this time, which was 2 more than the first time, and she received it the next morning at breakfast when he set it beside her coffee, a sealed envelope addressed in his large, careful hand. Mrs. Theodora Norris, Millhaven, Texas. Even though he was sitting 3 feet away and she could simply have turned around. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. He was drinking his coffee with the expression of a man attempting to appear indifferent to the outcome of something he is not at all indifferent to. She opened the letter and read it at the breakfast table and did not try to keep her face composed, because there was no one in the kitchen to manage an impression for, and she had long since stopped managing impressions around Cyrus. When she finished, she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and was quiet for a moment. 6 pages, she said. I have more to say than I used to, he said. She looked up at him. 34 years old, this woman, with her auburn hair and her brown eyes and a small scar on her left hand from a kitchen accident in 1887, and the residual warmth in her expression that had been there from the day he first saw her in the general store and had not diminished by a single degree in the intervening years. You always had more to say, she said. You just needed the right reader. He thought about this. You, he said. Me, she said. Always me. She stood up from the table and came around to where he was sitting, and he turned in his chair, and she put her hands on either side of his face the way he had once held hers, with that particular careful tenderness, and she looked at him for a long moment with everything she had 10 years of a life built from nothing, from $4.30 and a dead man's advertisement, from a stage arriving in a small Texas town on a cold February morning, from 5 Sunday walks by a creek, from a letter written on 4 pages by a man who had never written a letter before and found that, when he finally did, he had more to say than he had imagined. I love you, she said. In the most specific possible way, not a feeling I could have for anyone, a feeling I have for you. He put his hands over hers, still holding his face, and said, I love you exactly the same way. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was coming in at that angle it always did in October, the golden clarity that the Texas Hill Country managed for 6 weeks before winter, and the roses along the south wall had gone to hips now, bright and red, and the peach trees had lost their leaves. And the land spread east from the ranch house to the horizon, with all 47 years of Theodora's and Cyrus's accumulated effort laid across it in fences and water lines and grazing pastures, and the small, exact signs of a life that was not finished, but was deeply, firmly, irrevocably built. James Norris would go to university in Austin in 1899, the first in his family on either side to do so, and he would become a lawyer who spent a significant portion of his career working on land rights cases in West Texas, partly because of what he had watched his father navigate with the Harker dispute, and partly because of the hours he had spent as a boy listening to his mother explain why the way documents were written mattered as much as what they said. Clara Norris would marry in 1903, a man from Fredericksburg who was a school teacher and who, Cyrus said upon meeting him, had the look of a man who had been asked a question he intended to spend his whole life answering, which Clara said was the most romantic thing her father had ever said without knowing he was being romantic, and Cyrus did not entirely disagree. Eduardo Norris would take over the management of the ranch in his 20s, running it with the same physical energy he had been born with and the financial precision he had learned from his mother, and the Norris spread would continue to grow under his management, slowly and sustainably, the way his parents had built everything without haste, without waste, with consistent attention to what was real and what was lasting. Frances Ellsworth would live to 90, which no one was entirely surprised by, and she would visit Millhaven 3 more times in her life and would always pronounce herself satisfied with what she found, which was the same thing every time. Her daughter happy, in the specific and irreplaceable way of a woman who has found the exact right life. And Cyrus Norris would continue to write letters to his children when they were away. Letters to Eduardo Gonzalez and to James Patterson and to Otis Briggs, who retired from the county commissioner's office in 1897 and moved to San Antonio and somehow maintained a correspondence with Cyrus for the next 15 years about everything from cattle markets to the novels they were both reading. Letters to Theodora, several times when she was away visiting her mother or her sister, and once on each of their subsequent anniversaries, the letters growing longer and more various and always more articulate, the handwriting unchanged, large, deliberate, individual, entirely his own. He had never written a letter before he wrote her those first 4 pages, and the writing of them had opened something in him that did not close again, a channel between what he felt and what he could say, and it stayed open for the rest of his life, fed by the presence of a woman who had looked at the way he put words on paper and told him it looked like honesty and care and clarity, which was the same as telling him that he himself was worth looking at. In the evenings in their later years, they sat on the porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house, in the good chairs that Cyrus had made himself over a winter in 1898, and watched the light change on the land and talked or were quiet, equally comfortable with both. The children were grown and gone, and the house was quieter, but not empty. It was filled in the way that a place is filled when it has been lived in completely, when every room holds the residue of actual life, and the silence in it is the silence of something full rather than something abandoned. Theodora would reach for his hand sometimes in those evenings, automatically, without looking, and he would take it the same way, and they would sit like that while the stars came up above the hill country, and the cedars moved in the evening wind and the roses along the south wall held the last of the light. He had built the ranch with his hands. She had built the life with her mind and her heart, and her absolute refusal to manage less than the full truth of herself with another person. Together they had built something that was neither of those things separately, but something more complete than either. The specific, unrepeatable architecture of 2 people who had chosen each other clearly, and continued to choose each other every day for decades, not from obligation or convention, but from the repeated and renewable discovery that this, here together, was the best of all the available possibilities. The letter stayed in the cedar box. All 6 of them eventually, the first 4 pages and the subsequent ones, folded with care in their envelopes, addressed in that large, deliberate hand to Mrs. Theodora Norris, Millhaven, Texas, as if she might not otherwise know where to find herself. She always knew where to find herself. She had known from the first October morning when she stood on the porch of a stone ranch house 6 miles east of Millhaven and looked at the land and felt, for the first time in her life, that she had arrived somewhere she had been going all along. She was home. He was home. The roses bloomed every June and the peaches came in August, and the stars above the Texas hill country were extravagant and permanent and indifferent to everything except their own burning. And beneath them, in the good chairs on the wraparound porch, Cyrus Norris held his wife's hand in the gathering dark and was, in the most honest and complete sense of the word, content. It was more than he had planned for. It was more than he had known to plan for. It was everything.